song, every time I hear it, just really touches me in a deep place. I think the sentiment of it and the idea of it. I also recall as a young boy. I think I was 2 when the song came out in '74. But I remember it was on the radio a lot. My dad was in the radio business, so I heard the song a lot. And I even remember having a conversation with my dad at one point where he was talking about this song and how he certainly hopes he's never like this dad in that song where he doesn't have that connection with me. And I think for the most part he did hold true to that, and I'm very thankful for that. But there was times in his life where he did work a lot and he wasn't home, and that's certainly, we can never change that. And I think that song hit me at a young age. Maybe just thinking about being an adult at some point, I'm like, I sure hope if I'm ever a dad, I'm not like that too. Or just relating to it in that deep sense, like how sad that would be if you miss this opportunity to connect with your son or to connect with your father again. So that's one that's always stuck with me. It's funny, as I was planning to do this talk, I really didn't have any clear indications of a song, because I always like to try to throw a song that matched that. But I was driving my kids to school the other day, and that song popped on, and I'm like, I need to call Chris and see if he can do this. So again, thank you, Chris, for finding that. So that leads us into the topic today on what's next, and the topic is actually what's next. And this is a topic that I think that we're all familiar with, because our whole life is geared towards this what's next phase. We're born into this world, and what's next is either silently or more audibly stated to us from our parents. Is like, come on, learn to eat, learn to walk, learn to talk. We're constantly encouraged to get to that next milestone in our lives, and then once we get past our toddler and our infant stage, then we're going into being kids, and it's what's next with schooling. Learn so that you can figure out your career, and then figure out what college you want to go to, and then figure out your career. So this idea of what's next is constantly been ingrained with us from the time that we were born. And to a certain degree, that's fine. I think that we have to have this idea of, okay, what is our next step going to be in our life? We got to have some sort of plan. We certainly could just go willy-nilly and see what happens, and I think in many cases that's okay. But there is a certain amount of planning that we have to do with our lives. And while that's great, I think where the struggle lies with this, and where the challenge lies in this, is that when we get caught in this what's next, I mean, we're constantly bombarded with this idea of what's next out in our society today, with advertising, with marketing, with having to rush here from there, those with families or even those with grandchildren, or anywhere we are, we're always feeling like, okay, where do we go next and all that. So it's constantly there. And I think, again, the key is to recognize that it's okay to plan. It's okay to think about what's next. But when we get stuck there, when we get stuck in the what's next, that it really takes us away from being here in the present moment and the gifts that are always present for us in that present moment. These things that are brought into our path every day for our awareness to have that personal growth, both for ourselves and then with our personal growth, being able to have that connection with others in the world. When we're not here and focused and ready and present in this moment, we miss out on all of these things. And so it becomes a distraction as opposed to a strategy. Planning certainly can be a strategy. We want to make sure that we're ready for retirement or whatever. But when we just only constantly think about that, then it's not a strategy anymore. It's a distraction. And so that is one thing that certainly gets us into the what's next, this idea of making sure that we plan for the next step. Like if we don't have it all figured out, somehow we're not doing our role, we're not being who we need to be, or our idea of worth is tied to how much we have planned and how much we're going forward. But we have to dismiss this idea that what's next defines us. I mean, truly what defines us is what now. What's next can also take another shape in that sometimes we fear what's next, right? That next step, that next level of growth, that next level of healing. And so what's next can certainly play two roles, that keeping us distracted or preventing us from moving forward because we have that fear of what's next. And that can be anything from our own personal healing, our own spiritual growth, our social interactions. I don't know if you're like me, sometimes I think about I have to go out into a social situation and where I might not know a whole lot of people, and I'm not naturally an outgoing kind of person. I'm more of an introvert. So when I think about going into a social situation, this whole what's next almost becomes paralyzing. Instead of, and what I've learned, and why it makes it so that I can actually get up and talk in front of people and things, is that I've realized that when I get in the social situation, it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but there's always a gift that comes out of that, some level of growth that comes from me, or a connection that I make with somebody, or a story that I hear, or something that I relate that makes that connection there. So instead of getting caught in this fear of what's next of going into a social situation, I can learn to soften a little bit and embrace the fact that it has something to offer. Family certainly can be one of those. This idea of getting with family we haven't been together with for some time can have this, what's next, what's going to happen when we get together. And so this fear of what's next can certainly get in our way, and even things like weather. I think sometimes we all get caught up in, this weather's going to come, and we spend our whole day or a couple of days planning and getting ready for all that, and we have this just distraction of fear of what's next. And if we could just let that go, and as we know here in Des Moines, weather maybe hits, they say, what it's going to do 1 out of 3 times. And so at the end of it, we all go through all this worry, and at the end of it, we realize that, was it even worth it? And most of the time, it's not. So I'll certainly admit that I am a long-time sufferer, or, I must say, I've been long suffer and challenge with what's next. It's been my default. And my first career that I chose was working as a chef. And that is the epitome of what's next, right? I mean, when you work in the restaurant business, there is no, let's just be in the moment and enjoy this thing. I mean, it's like, really, how many tasks can you do at a time? And I loved it. I loved that fast-paced environment. I loved, being able to say, okay, I've got 15 things to do this morning between 9 and 11, and let's see how many I can actually get all those things done. And it was great. It was a great balancing act. It was a great rush, but it's always about what's next. And that's the nature of the beast, and you can't change that. And my point is that, let's change the restaurant business and make it so that we can be more in the present moment. That wouldn't serve any of us very well, would it? And I think sometimes we experience that when we go to a restaurant and, where's our food? It's been 20 minutes. And I think maybe the guys in the line are meditating or something like that. I don't know. Maybe we can think that next time when our food isn't coming out on time. We'll just say, they're being in the present moment back there and really spending that time with my dish that they need to. But anyways, my whole point about the restaurant business and the constant what's next is, and being a chef and being the manager, that I always had my expectations for everybody were, this is what you got to do, and you got to get it done by then. There really was no other answer for that. There was no other way that it should be done. And so, as a manager, you kind of get caught up in this sometimes. And I felt like I was a good manager in that I always got the tasks done. Things ran, I had good numbers and all that. But the piece, and reflecting upon that many years later, is that I missed so many opportunities to connect with people that I was working with. As a manager, I'd have assistant managers, or being an assistant manager, working for a chef, the whole communication piece that didn't happen, that I think could have allowed for a lot of growth for the people I was working with in a mentoring capacity, or just hey, maybe if you thought about it this way, or if you did that. And there certainly was some education with that. But I do look back and think about a lot of opportunities where I didn't connect with people, or take that moment to be in the moment and say, hey, well, let's think about it this way. And it was really just because I had to get to what's next, or perceived that I had to get to what's next. And the other times that I felt like that whole what's next got in the way was that I didn't always appreciate where somebody was in their process of life. A cook would come in late, and I would say at the time, his sob story, and then I'm like, I don't have time for your story, and I wouldn't have that empathy or that compassion, when we're so driven by this idea of what our agenda is or what our expectations are, that we can lose this piece of connection, this understanding, this empathy, this compassion. And so that's one thing that if I could go back and wave my magic wand and do it all again, which I know is impossible, I think I would have softened my heart a little bit more and been a little bit more compassionate, and at least, if not in the moment, taken that time to say, I'm sorry, Joe, that whatever happened at home, maybe not in that moment, being able to circle back on it and have that connection. I think anytime when we get dismissed, or when our true hurts are just overlooked for a situation, that that's when it stings even more deeply. So that's where what's next can get in the way, and that's one of my times where I recognize the whole what's next. As I got out of the restaurant business, I kind of shifted gears and went the opposite extreme. I am now a licensed massage therapist, which is really about totally being in the moment, right? I mean, that's how it's supposed to be, and a lot of times it works that way. But, you know, we're human creatures, and this whole what's next is not something that I think we can ever escape or bypass. This what's next is always going to be there because that's how we're wired. We're wired to be in the what's next. One of my early mentors in the massage business, we were having a conversation one day, and I was getting really excited about my plan for the business and my plan for teaching. I taught massage therapy for a little while too, and she was very supportive. But she also said, "Well, let's think about this for a second." And the way she put it to me is that I have a tendency to count like this. These are my steps. 1, 2, 3, 10, right? Or if I'm doing a list of things, A, B, C, Z. Like I have a tendency to like get really excited. I know the first things that I want to do, but then I want to jump to the end. It's like, you know, reading a good book. Sometimes my son is a classic of this. He gets really into a book and he'll read the first couple chapters. Then I'll see him sneak to the last pages because he just has to know what happens. And so, and you know, to a certain degree, we all can relate to that. But when we skip to the end, when we skip over all those middle parts, that's what we're doing. We're missing the good, the substance, everything that truly is, that has the lessons in it, that has that growth, this idea of completion. When we skip steps, we're not allowing for whatever's to be learned in those steps. You know, we skip over these learning opportunities, and between 3 and 10, I mean, that's 7. That's 7 things that we're not allowing ourselves to learn. And so I've kept that every time I get into something new, because regardless, as I know this, and it's something that loops in my brain of things, is this whole counting thing. Regardless, every time I get into something that I'm excited about, I'm always like trying to skip a few steps. I'm like, all right, take a step back. And I'm almost getting it that I can start a new project and not skip a few steps, but it still is something that's there. So again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend time or energy thinking about what's next. Let's just not get caught there. I think of constantly being in this idea of what's next is kind of like watching an action movie or a suspense movie or a thriller where you're sitting there, you're getting into it, and it's starting to build, and I myself notice myself, I'm sitting there, and if I'm watching a movie with my wife, I feel like I'm actually gripping her leg tightly, and I'm like, okay, let that go, and I'm like, all right, just relax, it's just a movie. 10 seconds later, I'm like in this tense state again. And so when we're constantly in the what's next, we may not realize it, but this is the energy that we're starting to build from the inside. This is the energy that is moving us through our lives, is this constant tension, this constant anxiety about what's next. And we don't even recognize it until, oh man, my neck starts to hurt, or you start having some kind of physical symptoms that come out. And I think this is one way that stress comes into our life in a seemingly benign way, or a seemingly unknown way, or unconscious way, is this idea that what's next is building this suspense, this energy of tension and anxiety. So, you know, that's where it's important at any point, is to take a moment and breathe and pause. And I think that's the whole thing about this what's next, is that we got to allow this time that we can stop, take a breath, and pause. So I talked a little bit in the restaurant business about how we miss these times for communication. And it's not just true in our professions, but in our personal lives. We get into our daily lives, and whether we have a partner or not, or if we're friends or socially, whatever, we always have things that we're doing in our life. And our agendas certainly are important. We've got to make sure we get to A to B. We've got to get to work on time. We've got to pick up the kids on time. We've got to run our errands. But when we get caught up in our lists, in our expectations of what we're going to do with our day, then we miss that opportunity to connect with our people. And the whole what's next works better when we start communicating. And I'll give an example. Just recently, I had an opportunity to have a morning with my daughter. Was going into work later that day, and she has a music class that she does on Friday mornings. And I don't ever get to go to it because I usually work at that time. But my schedule shifted for that day, and I had an opening, and so I told my wife I'd be happy to take her that day, and we'd go out and we'd do some things in the morning, and it would be great. So I had this whole morning planned, and also we're going to have time to go out. I know where she's going to be. Maybe I could do a few errands, and so I started building my list, and she'll have fun. We'll do all these errands together. She likes to go out. She likes to be involved in things. And so I started building my list of all these things that I was going to do, and my wife was taking the kids to school. She was going to come back, and then we were going to go, and that was the plan, right? And so that was great. And in my head, I had started like, all right, so I'm going to be able to leave by 8:45. That's going to give me enough time to do this. And I was working out this whole schedule, and it was great. And then it's 8:45, and I'm like, all right, Sandy's going to be home any second now. We're going to get going. I'm going to do all this, and then it was 8:50, 9 o'clock, 9:10, 9:15. So now I'm a half hour off schedule, right? And so my expectations for my day, my what's next has been affected. And so I'm starting to cross things off my list, and I'm getting a little steamed because, I had this plan, right? My what's next, I had it all planned out perfectly. And then when she finally came home and I realized that, all right, I'm going to be able to do one of these things on my list of whatever. And really, truly, that's fine. And I did come to peace with that pretty immediately because I didn't want to be going out with my daughter and like, all right, get in the car. That wasn't the interaction I was looking to have with my daughter. I had this morning with my daughter. And so I just said, you know what? We're going to be able to do that. We'll see how it goes. If anything else happens, that's great. And my point is not that my wife did anything wrong, because she did it. I didn't communicate my plan. I didn't communicate my what's next. My what's next was all right here. And I made the assumptions that she was just going to go do her thing and come back and didn't leave any room for that. Maybe she wants to do something else. If she does, that's fine. I don't even have a problem with it. I don't even have a problem that she didn't tell me she was going to do something else. My whole point was that I got stuck in my what's next, and I allowed that to affect my world, especially since I didn't communicate that. If I had said to my wife before she left, hey, I really would like to do these things, right, before we go to music class, I'm certain she would have obliged. She would have been more than happy to make that schedule work. So it's that not communicating piece that gets us in trouble when we get into the what's next. I just set myself up for that one, right? And I think maybe we've all done that at some point in our life where we have our own expectations, but we didn't communicate it clearly and things don't go as planned. And so that's one way where I feel like communication in the what's next can certainly help us get through the next. So, and another thing with communicating with others, especially those who are closer in our life, friends, family, loved ones, and the whole what's next is sometimes we're caught in the what's next, like who's going to make the next move? Who's going to be the one who's going to have that conversation that we need to have or to stir that? And we get stuck in this fear of, okay, who's going to do what, or this inaction of who's going to do the what's next part of that relationship. So again, just emphasizing the idea that communication is something that doesn't matter where we are with our what's next process. If we can communicate where we are in that process, that we can help each other get through that. Another time, and this goes back to the Cats in the Cradle song and this idea of being too busy to be with our loved ones or even taking time for ourselves. In the restaurant business, I never wanted to have kids because I know I wouldn't be home. An 80-hour work week is not conducive to having a family. So I never wanted to have kids. I left that business, and thankfully it opened up the doors for me having now 3 children. And I couldn't be happier that change happened. And my whole life since having children and changing careers has been, I want to make sure that I'm available and I have time for them. And sometimes my expectations for that are far higher than they need to be. But I do make a concerted effort to be present for them. And it's sometimes an exercise. We own our own small businesses, and so when you own your own business, there's always this what's next element that's inherent with that. But I continue to catch myself knowing that when my kids are around, I need to be with them, and my what's next can wait until after they're in bed or when they're at school or things like that. And another thing in our expectations of people in our world, I grew up doing chores on Saturday mornings. That was our thing. I mean, we did responsibilities all during the week, but Saturday morning was like, that's where that long list came out. I never liked it as a kid. I don't think anybody enjoys doing chores for the sake of, I'm going to get in there and do all this. I think as adults we appreciate the end result of doing chores, and sometimes we enjoy the process of doing them. But Saturday mornings was always a thing, and we have put that on our kids too. And I mean, it just makes sense, right? You've got your school week, Saturday morning you get all the responsibilities out of the way, then you got that whole day and a half of nothing to do, and so it's been on our schedule for as long as the kids have been doing their responsibilities. I don't know how long that's been actually, but they get up in the morning on Saturdays, they get to watch their cartoons or do their games or whatever, and then 9 o'clock it's like, all right, eat some breakfast and let's get on our responsibilities. And as you can imagine, the kids aren't always like, yes, we get to do our responsibilities now. And in fact, I don't know what would happen if they actually did that. Most of the times there's grumblings, and my youngest son in particular, he gets bent as soon as he knows responsibilities are coming. He's done. I mean, and I see him glaze over, and he gets this look on his face, and I'm just like, I know, buddy, but if we just get them done, then it can be whatever. And for whatever reason, probably because my inner self was really speaking loud one morning, just instead of going from that to that, I just spent some like, hey, why don't we it just naturally worked out that all of us were hanging out in the living room. And we just started goofing off and playing around and just spending some time interacting with each other. And you know, I looked up at the clock and it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours later. We'd just been goofing off in the living room for the morning. And man, that was awesome. That was great. I didn't feel like I had to jump in and do my things. I didn't have to sit there and crack the whip and get them on task and grumble. And so we kind of have a new routine where they get to do their thing in the morning, and then we have some time where we connect with each other. And then we kind of send them off, and they do their things, and we do our things. And so we changed the whole what's next schedule. And I mean, there's still the pending what's next. And most Saturdays, most of the things get done, and sometimes they don't. But I'm no longer like so rigid on, okay, this has to be done today. Because I mean, at the end of the day, sure, we want to have a clean house. But more than a clean house, I want to make sure that I spend some time and connected with my kids. And I think that's when we're looking at the what's next. I mean, is the what's next really so important that we can't take time for ourselves, that we can't take time to connect with one another, that we can't take time to just be for a little bit? And so that was another what's next kind of shift in thinking for me. One of the last ones I want to relate is, you know, sometimes we get stuck in the what's next and the fear of what's next. And I'm going to use my younger son, Cohen. He had a buddy in his class that just all of a sudden came across the news. He's moving somewhere else in the state. This was his best buddy that he always wanted to hang out with and all of that. And so he came home, and of course he was a little crestfallen. He was really upset. His buddy's moving. He's not going to be able to see him anymore. And it was really getting stuck in the woe of it all. And it was like, this was a Monday, and he was leaving the following Monday, or maybe it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. But the turnaround was quick, like, oh my gosh, he's going to be gone. And so he was getting all upset, and I'm like, well, hey, why don't we just see if we can have a play date or have a sleepover at least this weekend so you can have some time with him. And thankfully it all worked out. That got to have a play date, and his friend got to stay over, and that was good. And I think what I got out of this is that sometimes we get this idea of we know something's going to happen, something's going to change with somebody in our life, whether it's somebody's moving or we know somebody's ill, and we can get caught up in the emotion of that. And that's not to say that those emotions aren't important, but when we get stuck in that as opposed to what can we do in this present moment to take advantage of what we need with that. And I think when somebody's transitioning, whether it's a friend moving or somebody's moving on with illness or whatever, that if we can take time to connect with them, then we can have this sense of closure, this sense of, I know I've done everything I could to spend that time with them. I know that I've been present with them, and I can feel my heart and the emotion of that. And I think that's another thing we're getting out of the fear aspect of what's next, and being in the present moment allows us to connect. And so what the takeaways for all this is that it's okay to think about what's next, just don't get stuck there. And if you do get stuck there, then try to identify why it is that you feel you need this distraction or what that fear is. I mean, that's where the lesson is. I think anytime I feel like I'm reeling, I need to be on the what's next. It's like, okay, what are you avoiding in the right now? Because that's really what it's about when we get in that distracted place. It's about avoiding what's right now. So what is that emotion? What is that fear? What is that idea of lacking? So we have to be open to what's now. And the best way to do that is just be patient. Sometimes we get into that, okay, let's reflect upon it, and it's really uncomfortable, and we're like, I don't really want to be here, I don't really want to figure out what this whole thing is, and it may not be immediately clear sometimes, but that's where we have to be patient and just come back to it. We'll go back into the distraction, but always come back to the what's now. Because in the present moment, that's where the gifts are. That's where the understanding, the deeper understanding of ourselves, and therefore our way to be able to be more understanding and connecting with other people in the world with this whole human experience thing. And we know that the only certainty about what's next is that you can never be certain that it'll come about exactly as you want it to. So that's my takeaways about what's next. And of course, I have to say what's next is some special music. But before we do that, we're going to take an offering for Unity of Des Moines.